My name is Corinne Ashby, and I am 58 years old. On the morning of the 3rd anniversary of my husband's death, I had a suitcase by the front door, a small wooden box wrapped in a dish towel, sitting on the passenger seat of my car, and a plane ticket to International Falls, printed out on the kitchen counter. I was 40 minutes from leaving for the airport when my son called to tell me the trip was off. He didn't ask. He informed me, the way you'd inform someone about a change in the weather. "Mom, something's come up. We're going to need to push this." I was standing in the kitchen with my coat already on, one arm in the sleeve, and I just stood there, half-dressed to leave, listening to my only son explain, in a very calm and reasonable voice, why the trip to scatter his father's ashes could wait a little longer. I didn't argue. I took my arm back out of the sleeve, hung the coat on the hook by the door, and sat down at the kitchen table across from the little wooden box, because I already knew, somewhere underneath the part of me that was still being polite, that "something's come up" was going to mean something very different than what he wanted me to think, and that I was not going to like how I found out. If you've ever had someone tell you to wait one more time, wait for the money, wait for the right moment, wait until it's convenient for everyone but you, tell me where you're watching this from tonight. I have a feeling I'm not the only one sitting with a suitcase that never got used. Walt and I met at Kettle Lake the summer I was 22, when I was waitressing at a supper club, and he was up from Duluth with 3 friends who couldn't fish to save their lives. We were married 35 years. He built the dock at the cabin himself, board by board, over 4 summers, because he said a man ought to be able to point at something and say his own hands made it. He died on a Tuesday in October, at his desk, of a heart that had been quietly failing for longer than either of us knew. I promised him, before the funeral home even came, that I would take him back to the lake myself, someday, when I could stand to. I taught 5th grade for 31 years at the elementary school 2 miles from this house, and if there is one thing 3 decades in a classroom teaches you, it is how to stay calm while something is quietly going wrong in front of you. A child crying in the coat closet, a boy in the back row who has clearly not eaten breakfast again. You learn to notice everything and startle at nothing. Walt used to tease me that I had the same face for a broken dishwasher as I did for a broken arm. I didn't think of it as a skill so much as a habit until the year I needed it more than I ever had before. Grief, I learned, does not move in a straight line, no matter what the pamphlets tell you. Some months I could talk about him easily, tell stories at dinner, laugh at the memory of him arguing with a fish finder he never learned to use. Other months I couldn't drive past the marina without pulling over. The lake trip became, in my mind, less an errand and more a kind of finish line, the last big, hard thing I owed him, and myself. It took me 3 years to be ready. I finally was. I'd bought the plane ticket in September. I'd called ahead and rented the same little cabin 2 down from ours, because I didn't think I could bear to stay in our own. I'd told exactly 4 people, my sister, my next-door neighbor, my minister, and my son, Grant. Grant is 34. He's a real estate broker here in Duluth, married to a woman named Denise, and together they have my 2 grandchildren, Ellie, who is 8, and Sam, who just turned 6. Grant was always my careful child, not the loudest, not the one who got in trouble, but the one who watched every room before he stepped into it. His father used to say Grant kept his cards so close to his chest, you needed a crowbar to see his hand. I used to think that was just his personality. I did not yet understand it was also, sometimes, a strategy. When Grant was 11, he lost $40 of paper route money and told us for 3 weeks that the route manager had shorted him, rather than admit he'd spent it on a video game at the mall with friends. I only found out the truth 2 decades later, at his own wedding rehearsal dinner, when he brought it up as a funny story about himself, laughing easily at a version of the memory that had, by then, lost all its teeth. I laughed along with him that night. I did not yet know I would spend a chunk of my 58th year on Earth relearning exactly how long my son could hold a story steady before it cracked. 2 years ago, I had a small health scare, dizzy spells that turned out to be nothing, but which frightened all of us for about a month before the tests came back clear. In that month, Grant sat me down and said he thought it made sense for him to be added to my accounts, just in case, so someone could help me with the online banking and the bills if anything ever happened suddenly. I said yes without thinking twice. He was my son. And more than that, he was the co-trustee, alongside me, of something Walt had set up the year before he died, the Ashby Education Trust, $140,000, meant for exactly one purpose: Ellie and Sam's college education, untouched until they turned 18. I want you to hold on to that number. $140,000, because in about 20 minutes it is going to matter very much. Ellie is 8, and she is, without question, the most serious 8-year-old I have ever met, teacher's pension, and 31 years of classroom experience included. She lines her stuffed animals up by height. She asked me, the week before all of this started, whether compound interest was something she'd need for the spelling bee, because she'd heard her father say it on the phone and wanted to be ready in case it came up. Sam is 6, missing his 2 front teeth, and cannot walk past a puddle without testing its depth personally. Walt used to say Sam was going to either run a company or get arrested trying to improve one, and there wasn't much room in between. I tell you this because I need you to understand that when I talk about $140,000, I am not really talking about a number. I am talking about Ellie's tuition at the university she is already, at 8, plotting to attend. I am talking about whatever Sam grows into needing room for. Walt used to sit at this same kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad, running projections for 2 children who, when he set that trust up, were 4 and 2 years old and had no idea a grandfather they'd barely gotten to know was already trying to hold a door open for them 15 years into their own future. "Mom, I don't think you should go alone." That was what Denise said to me on the phone, 2 days after Grant canceled the trip, when I told her I was going to rebook it myself, by myself, the following month. She said it kindly. Denise is not a cruel woman. She has just spent 8 years learning to agree with my son the way water learns the shape of a riverbed. It's a lot right now, with everything going on with Grant's business. Maybe just wait until things settle. I asked her what, exactly, was going on with Grant's business. She went quiet in a way I'd come to recognize. "You should really talk to Grant about that," she said, and changed the subject to Sam's science fair project. 3 days after that call, I got a letter in the mail from the cabin rental company at Kettle Lake. It was not a confirmation. It was a notice that the deposit payment on my reservation had been returned for insufficient funds, and that unless it was resolved within 10 days, the booking, the one I had personally asked Grant to handle from our joint household account, because I trusted him to, because he'd told me it was done, would be canceled entirely. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time, because there was more than enough money in that account to cover a $400 cabin deposit. I balanced that account myself, every month, out of habit, the same way Walt used to. There was no reason for that payment to bounce. Unless the money that should have covered it wasn't there anymore. I want to tell you honestly, I did not march over to my son's house and demand an explanation. That is not how I was raised, and it is not who I became after 35 years married to a patient man. What I did instead was quieter, and in hindsight, it was the first decision that actually mattered. I drove to my bank, in person, and asked for a printed statement of every transaction on that joint account for the past 18 months. Then I asked the same for the Ashby Education Trust. It took the branch manager, a kind woman named Patty who'd known me for a decade, almost 40 minutes to pull it all. She kept glancing up at me while she did, the way people do when they suspect you're about to have a very bad afternoon and there's nothing they can do to stop it. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when you are reading numbers and your brain refuses, for a moment, to translate them into meaning. I sat in Patty's little glass office and looked at 11 separate withdrawals from the Education Trust over 14 months, ranging from $2,200 to just under $9,000. each one authorized with Grant's signature, using the co-trustee authority Walt had given him for emergencies only, emergencies I had never once been told about. The total came to just over $51,000. More than a third of what his father had left for two little kids who didn't yet know how to do long division. I didn't cry in that office. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect the crying to come first, and for me it didn't. What came first was a kind of stillness, the same stillness I remembered from the morning Walt died, when the paramedics were still working and some part of my mind had already, quietly, without my permission, accepted what was happening. I thanked Patty. I asked her to make me a second copy. And I drove home and put both copies in the bottom drawer of Walt's old desk, underneath his fishing license, and I did not say one word to Grant. 3 days later, hold on to this, because it's going to matter. 3 days later, my son called to ask if I could watch Ellie and Sam for the weekend so he and Denise could get away and clear their heads. I said of course. I always say of course. And while those two children were coloring at my kitchen table, I began, very carefully, to understand exactly how patient I was going to have to be. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for the rest of this story. What I found in that bank statement was not a son in crisis borrowing from his children's future because he had no other choice. If it had been that, if he had come to me, ashamed, and said, "Mom, the business is failing, I don't know what else to do," I believe I would have found a way to forgive it, even while I fixed it. What made this different, what turned grief and disappointment into something colder and clearer, was the 11 withdrawals in 14 months, each one carefully sized to stay under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic letter to me as co-trustee. Someone had studied that threshold. Someone had planned around me finding out. At Ellie's soccer game the following Saturday, I sat next to Grant on the cold aluminum bleachers and asked him, as gently as I knew how the business was doing. He told me it was fine, better than fine actually. He'd just closed on a beautiful new listing out on the point. I asked if there'd been any trouble with cash flow lately, and I watched my son's face do something I had only seen it do twice before in his life. Once at 16, when he wrecked his father's truck and had a whole speech prepared before I even asked. And once at 9, standing over a broken lamp with his sister's name already halfway out of his mouth. "Why would you ask that?" he said. Not a question, a wall. I told him I'd gotten a strange letter about the cabin deposit bouncing. I watched him recover in real time, the way a man writes a canoe, before anyone in the boat even feels it tip. "Bank error," he said. "I already called them about it. It's handled." He smiled at me. It was a good smile. He'd had 34 years to practice it. I smiled back, and I said that was a relief. And I meant it the way you mean something you already know is a lie you're both agreeing to keep telling. The following Wednesday, I invited Grant to dinner alone, without Denise or the children, which I almost never do. I made his favorite as a boy, pork chops with the apple gravy Walt used to request for his own birthday, and I gave him, deliberately, 3 separate openings over the course of that meal to tell me the truth without my having to drag it out of him. I asked how the business's cash reserves were holding up heading into the slow season. I asked, gently, whether there was anything at all he needed help with, reminding him that his father and I had weathered our own lean years early in our marriage and had never once been too proud to say so to each other. I even told him straight out, setting down my fork, that whatever was going on, I would rather hear it from him directly than piece it together on my own. Each time, he smiled the same good smile and told me everything was fine, better than fine, and changed the subject to a new listing or to Sam's upcoming school play. By dessert, he was relaxed enough to laugh about a client who'd tried to negotiate a commission down, and I sat across from my son, eating apple gravy over pork chops, watching him be utterly at ease inside a lie I already had 11 pieces of paper proving false, folded in the bottom drawer of his father's desk, not 40 feet from where we sat. I want to be honest about what that dinner cost me. I had genuinely hoped, walking into that evening, that he would tell me himself, that I would get to be a mother, helping her son through a hard patch, instead of a woman quietly building a case in a manila folder. There is a particular kind of grief in watching someone choose, 3 separate times, not to be honest with you when you have all but handed them the words. It is not the same grief as losing a husband. It is smaller and stranger, and in some ways it took longer to sit with, because there was no funeral for it, no casseroles on the porch, no one who understood exactly what I'd lost that Wednesday over dessert. Just a clean kitchen, a son driving home satisfied that he'd managed his mother well, and me, alone with the dishes, finally admitting to myself that gentleness had run its course. 3 weeks passed. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell Denise what I knew. Instead, on a Tuesday, when I knew Grant had closings all afternoon, I drove to see Howard Voss, who has been our family's attorney for going on 30 years, who officiated at Grant's christening as a favor to Walt, and who still keeps a fishing photo of the 3 of us on his office wall. I laid Patty's statements out on his desk, without a word of preamble. Howard is not a man who reacts visibly to much of anything. He read every page twice. Then he took off his glasses, folded them, and said, very quietly, "Corinne, does Grant know you have these?" I told him no, and I told him I wanted to understand exactly what my rights were as co-trustee before he did. What Howard told me next changed the shape of everything that came after. He reminded me of something I had let myself forget in 3 years of grief, something Walt had insisted on, almost stubbornly, when they drew up the trust together the year before he died. Walt had wanted Grant involved, had wanted to teach him responsibility, but Walt had also, quietly, without telling me at the time, built in a safeguard. Any withdrawal above $5,000 required both trustees' signatures, not just one. The 11 withdrawals Grant made had all been kept under that number for a reason. But the trust document also contained something else, a clause allowing either trustee, upon reasonable belief the trust was being misused, to unilaterally freeze all further disbursements pending review. Walt had put that clause in himself. Howard remembered him doing it. "In case something happens to me and you're not sharp on the finances yet," Walt had told him, "I want Corinne protected either way." I sat in Howard's office for a long moment after he told me that, looking at the fishing photo on his wall, Walt, Howard, and a 22-year-old Grant, all 3 of them grinning over a stringer of walleye from a trip I hadn't gone on. I hadn't cried yet that day, and I want to tell you I didn't cry then either. What I felt instead was something closer to being handed an umbrella in the middle of a storm I hadn't realized I was already standing in, grateful, and a little unsteady, and abruptly aware of how long I'd been getting wet without noticing. My husband, 3 years in the ground, had reached forward through time and left me a lock and a key I didn't even know I was holding. I asked Howard to freeze it. That afternoon, quietly, through the paperwork, with no phone call, no confrontation, no announcement. I didn't want Grant to hear it from me in anger. I wanted him to feel it the next time he reached for something that was no longer there, the way I had felt it reading a bounced deposit notice at my own kitchen table. For 9 days after that, nothing happened. 9 days of Sunday dinners and school pickups and Grant asking, twice, in an oddly careful voice, whether I'd been by the bank recently. 9 days of me saying, "No, dear, why do you ask?" and watching something behind his eyes work very hard to stay calm. On the 10th day, Denise called me in tears. Not gentle tears, the kind that come out sideways, angry and frightened at once. A payment on their line of credit had failed. A contractor deposit for a listing renovation had bounced. Grant, she said, had gone white as a sheet, trying to move money between accounts that, as far as he knew, still had money in them. I let a silence sit on that phone call longer than was comfortable for either of us. Then I asked her, very simply, whether she'd like to come over and talk about it in person, with Grant, this weekend, family dinner. Nothing dramatic, just the 4 of us at my table, the way it used to be before I started keeping copies of things in Walt's desk drawer. I spent those 2 days before the dinner doing something I had never once done in 35 years, of being this family's quiet, accommodating center. I prepared. They arrived Sunday at 5. Grant looked thinner than I remembered, the particular thinness of a man who hasn't been sleeping. Denise's eyes were red-rimmed under her makeup. I served the pot roast Walt used to love, and I let them eat almost all of it, and I let Grant work his way, haltingly, toward the version of the story he'd clearly rehearsed in the car, a version involving temporary cash flow issues, and always intending to pay it back before the kids needed it. And, you weren't using that money for anything, Mom, it was just sitting there. I want you to notice that phrase, just sitting there, as though $140,000 meant for 2 children's futures was spare change collecting dust because I hadn't found a use for it yet. I let him finish. Then I got up, went to Walt's desk, and brought back the folder. I laid the bank statements on the table first, all 11 withdrawals highlighted in yellow, the dates lined up like a confession written in someone else's handwriting. Then I laid down a printout Howard had prepared, the freeze order, dated and filed, along with a formal accounting request that would require Grant, by law, to account for every withdrawn dollar or repay it with interest within 90 days. And then, last, I laid down the letter from the cabin rental company, the one that started all of it, the one that told me, in the driest possible language, that something in my family had quietly broken long before I ever suspected it. Grant didn't yell. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect the villain in a story like this to rage, and what I got instead was worse, in its way. A long, terrible silence, and then my son, looking at me, and saying the thing I don't think I will ever fully stop hearing. You've got the house, Mom. You've got your pension. You don't need a lake trip. He said it flatly, like a man laying down a winning hand. Ellie needs braces. Sam needs new skates. I didn't think you'd begrudge your own grandkids that. He used the money I found out was missing to justify the money that was still missing. He used his own children's names as a shield for spending their inheritance on something that had nothing to do with braces or skates at all. Because Howard's investigator, brought in that same week at my request, would later trace 18,000 of that 51 to an emergency payout to a former business partner, threatening a lawsuit Grant had never once mentioned to any of us. Denise made a small sound across the table, not quite a word. When I looked at her, she was staring at the highlighted statements like she was seeing them for the first time, which, it turned out, she was. You told me the business loan covered that, she said to Grant, quietly, and I watched my son's carefully built evening rearrange itself in real time, watched him realize the folder on the table wasn't the only thing that had just been laid open. Whatever Grant had told Denise to keep her calm through 14 months of missing money was, apparently, a slightly different lie than the one he'd told the bank, and a considerably different one than the truth. Is this true? She asked him. Not me, him. Grant didn't answer her either. He kept his eyes on the tablecloth, on the yellow highlighter lines, on anything that wasn't his wife's face or his mother's. And in that silence, I understood something about my son I hadn't fully let myself see before. That the smile I'd always found so reassuring, the one he'd used on me at the soccer game, the one Denise had presumably been on the receiving end of for months, wasn't reassurance at all. It was maintenance, a tool for keeping 2 separate rooms of his life from ever comparing notes. I did not raise my voice. I told him, calmly, that I loved him, that I would always love him, and that loving him was no longer going to mean protecting him from the truth of what he'd done. I told him the freeze would stay in place. I told him Howard's 90-day accounting was not a suggestion, and I told him that if he ever again used his own children as a reason to justify taking from them, he would not like what came next, because I had spent 35 years learning patience from a man who was, it turned out, patient enough to plan for this exact moment 3 years after his own funeral. Halfway through that sentence, I heard the soft thump of small feet on the stairs. Ellie, who was supposed to be asleep at my house that night while her parents talked business downstairs, standing at the bottom of the staircase in her socks, woken by something in the tone of the house, even though she couldn't have heard the words. I got up without finishing my sentence to Grant. walked her back upstairs myself, sat with her until her breathing evened out again, and did not tell her, then or ever, exactly what her father had done with money that had her name quietly attached to it. Some things a grandmother carries so a granddaughter doesn't have to. I came back downstairs 11 minutes later and picked the conversation up exactly where I'd left it, because some things also do not get to be interrupted twice. Denise didn't say much that night. She left early, taking the children, her face doing something complicated that I chose not to interpret for her. Grant repaid $11,000 within the first 30 days, borrowed against his own retirement account. The lawsuit from his former partner became public in a small item in the local business paper 2 months later, and 2 of his listing clients quietly walked. Ellie asked me, about a month into all of this, why her dad seemed sad all the time now, and why he and her mom kept having quiet conversations that stopped when she walked in. I told her, as honestly as an 8-year-old's question deserves and not 1 ounce more, that grown-ups sometimes make choices that take a while to fix, and that fixing them is exactly what her father was doing. She considered this with the same seriousness she brings to lining up her stuffed animals, nodded once, and asked if she could still come stay at Grandma's on Fridays. I told her that was never going to change, no matter what else did. Sam, for his part, remains blissfully unaware that any of this happened, which is exactly as it should be at 6 years old, and which is, not coincidentally, the entire reason his grandfather built that trust in the first place. He and Denise are, as of this recording, still working through what Howard's accounting is going to require of them, and I do not know yet how it ends for their marriage, or for his business, or for the easy Sunday dinners we used to have without anyone counting anything. I have decided I am at peace not knowing that part yet. Some doors you close slowly, on purpose, so you don't slam anyone's fingers in them by accident, even someone who didn't extend you the same courtesy. I flew to Kettle Lake alone, 6 weeks later than I'd planned, on a gray Thursday in November. I rented the same little cabin 2 doors down from ours. I walked out onto the dock Walt built with his own hands, board by board, over 4 summers, and I opened the small wooden box, and I said the things to him I had been saving for 3 years and 1 very complicated month. The wind was sharp enough that I could barely hear my own voice. I don't think that mattered. I think he heard it anyway. I used to believe that loving my children meant absorbing whatever they needed to take from me, quietly, so the family could stay smooth on the surface. I spent 35 years believing a good mother makes herself endlessly available to be drawn from, without asking why. I don't believe that anymore. And if you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. Your grief is not a resource for someone else's emergency. Your trust is not collateral for someone else's silence. And your children's future is not just sitting there simply because you haven't spent it on a crisis someone else created and hid from you. I didn't destroy my son. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the last gift I have left to give this story. I only stopped being the person who made it easy for the truth to stay buried. What surfaced after that, he built himself, withdrawal by withdrawal, over 14 quiet months, long before I ever opened that folder on my own kitchen table. Comment below if you found out someone you loved had been quietly taking from your children's future while telling you everything was fine. Would you have frozen it the way I did? Or would you have found a way to keep believing them a little longer? I'd like to know where you land. Whatever this story stirred up in you tonight, you're allowed to feel it. This is a work of fiction, written for reflection and entertainment, though I suspect some of you will recognize a shape in it that feels a little too familiar. If there's one thing worth carrying out of it, let it be this. The people who count on your silence are not always the people who deserve it, and finding that out is not the end of loving them. It's just the end of pretending you don't see them clearly.